My daughter's car was sitting sideways in a ditch off Route 9 with both doors wide open and her phone still on the seat. The engine was running. She was gone. The call came at 6 in the morning from a county deputy who didn't know her name yet. Only her plates. When he read them back to me, I had to sit down on the kitchen floor because my legs simply stopped working. My daughter had left the house the night before to meet someone she said could help us save the farm. She told me she'd be home by 10. She kissed me on the cheek, the way she always had since she was a little girl. And she said, "Don't worry. Dad, I know what I'm doing." Those were the last words I heard from her. Have you ever stood in a place that felt completely familiar and yet completely wrong at the same time? That's what it felt like driving to that stretch of highway. I knew every bend in Route 9. Had driven it 10,000 times in 63 years of living in Harlan County. But nothing about that morning felt like the world I knew. I kept telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. A medical emergency. A flattire. Something simple. Something I could fix. Then I saw her car. And the open doors. And I understood that whatever had happened to my daughter was not simple at all. She had left one voicemail. Recorded at 11:47 the previous night. 17 minutes before a passing trucker spotted her abandoned vehicle. Her voice was steady. The way it always got when she was frightened and trying not to show it. She said, "Dad, I need you to listen carefully. It's Mayor Cole. He knows about everything. He said our land was always meant to be his. And people like us were just keeping it warm for him. I'm going to be okay, but you need to know who did this. It's Harrison Cole. Whatever happens, don't let him take the farm." The recording cut off there. My daughter had always been the kind of person who finished what she started. When she was 9 years old, she rebuilt a broken-down bicycle from parts she found in our barn and sold it at the end of our driveway for $40. She gave 30 of it to the church collection that Sunday and spent the other 10 on seeds for her mother's garden. Her mother, God rest her soul, had laughed until she cried telling me that story that evening. Eleanor had been gone 11 years. But not a single day passed that I didn't feel her in that farmhouse. In the smell of the kitchen and the creak of the back porch and the roses she'd planted along the fence line that somehow kept blooming every summer without anyone tending them. I stood at that ditch on Route 9, and I thought about Eleanor, about what she would have expected of me. And I thought about what Harrison Cole had said to my daughter before she disappeared. People like us were just keeping it warm for him. The rage that moved through me then was quiet and cold. Not the kind that makes a man shout or throw things. It was the kind that settles into your bones and makes you very, very still. I had worked that land for 40 years. My father had worked it before me, and his father before him. We had survived droughts and floods and the farm crisis of the 80s, and every hard season the Lord saw fit to send us. And now the mayor of our own county, a man I had shaken hands with at the 4th of July parade not 3 months ago, had made my daughter disappear because she stood between him and what he wanted. I called my brother-in-law first. Raymond had served 22 years as a county sheriff, 2 counties over before his knees gave out and forced him into retirement. He was 68 years old, moved slower than he used to, and still had the sharpest mind of anyone I'd ever known. He answered on the second ring. I said, "My daughter is missing, and I think Harrison Cole is responsible." Raymond was silent for 4 seconds. Then he said, "I'll be there in 45 minutes. Don't talk to anyone else until I arrive." He made it in 38. We sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, the same one where I'd learned to read and where my daughter had done her homework every night through 12 years of school. And I played him the voicemail. Raymond listened with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the table. When it ended, he opened his eyes and looked at me with the expression I remembered from when he was still wearing a badge. "This isn't the first time Cole's done something like this," he said quietly. I stared at him. "You know about him." Raymond turned the coffee mug in his hands. "There have been whispers for years. 3 families in the western part of the county sold their properties to Cole's development company in the last decade under what I'd call unusual circumstances. The Brennan family, the Whitmores, the Galloways. Each of them had something go wrong right before they agreed to sell. A fire, A lawsuit that came out of nowhere. A family member who had an accident. He paused. Nobody could ever prove a connection. Cole's too careful for that. He wraps everything in layers. I thought about my daughter on that dark stretch of highway. He's not careful enough. Raymond called in favors that morning. Old colleagues. Retired deputies. A woman he'd once worked with who now consulted for the state attorney's office. I sat at the table and listened and tried not to look at the chair my daughter always sat in. By noon, a picture had begun to form that made my stomach feel hollow. Harrison Cole had been mayor for 9 years. Before that, he'd run the county's largest land development company. And the two roles had never been as separate as the law required. His company had acquired nearly 4,000 acres in Harlan County over the past 12 years. Almost all of it purchased from families who had initially refused to sell. The county permits his company needed always moved through the system faster than anyone else's. The zoning decisions always seemed to break in his favor. And when families pushed back, things had a way of going badly for them. Our farm sat on 212 acres of some of the best bottomland in the region. Cole had offered me $600,000 for it 18 months ago. I'd turned him down flat. Eleanor and I had planned to pass that land to our daughter, and no number on a check was going to change that. Cole had smiled and told me I was making a mistake, and that his offer had an expiration date. I hadn't heard from him directly since, but 6 weeks ago, my daughter had found a surveying crew on the back corner of our property with documents claiming an old easement dispute gave the county right of access. She'd driven them off with a legal letter from our attorney, in a manner that left no room for argument. That had apparently been the beginning. I was staring out the kitchen window at Eleanor's rose fence when my cell phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something told me not to. The voice on the other end was a woman's, low and careful, like someone speaking in a room where the walls might be listening. She said, "Mr. Hargrove, my name is Diane. I've worked as the administrative director for Mayor Cole's office for 6 years. I need to talk to you about your daughter." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles ached. "Is she safe?" "She's safe. She's at a cabin that belongs to one of Cole's associates, about 14 miles north of town. She wasn't physically harmed. They wanted to scare her. To scare you. To make you agree to sell before she could finish what she was working on. A pose. She'd found something. Mr. Hargrove. Something that could expose what Cole has been doing for years." He found out in panic. "Why are you telling me this?" There was a long silence on the other end. When she spoke again, her voice had changed slightly, the careful quality loosening just a little, because my mother's name was Whitmore. She was one of the families who sold to Cole 8 years ago. Sold for almost nothing, because someone cut the brake line on my brother's truck 2 weeks after my mother told Cole she wasn't interested in his offer. My brother survived. Barely. My mother signed the papers from his hospital room. I closed my eyes. I took that job because I wanted to know the truth. She said, "I've spent 6 years watching and listening and documenting. I have records. Mr. Hargrove. Emails. Financial transfers. Signed documents with names on them that would put Harrison Cole away for the rest of his life. All I needed was someone with enough to lose to stand up and fight him directly. Your daughter tried to do it alone. I'm asking you to do it right." Raymond drove while I sat in the passenger seat and stared at the road ahead and tried to think clearly. This could be a trap. Diane could be one of Cole's people, sent to draw me somewhere, isolated. Raymond said exactly that, quietly, without taking his eyes off the pavement. "I know," I said. But she knew things about the Whitmores she couldn't have known unless she was telling the truth about who she is. And she knew my daughter's name before I said it. Raymond was quiet for a moment. "We do this carefully. We bring people with us." We did. 2 of Raymond's former deputies, both retired but still sharp, followed in a second vehicle. We had a plan for if it was a trap, and we had a plan for if it wasn't. I had spent 30 years running a farm, which means I had spent 30 years making decisions with incomplete information and living with whatever came next. I wasn't a young man and I wasn't a reckless one. But I was a father whose daughter was 14 miles north of town in a cabin that belonged to someone who worked for the man who had made her disappear. Sometimes the decision makes itself. We found the cabin exactly where Diane had said it would be. One of Cole's associates, a man I recognized as his campaign manager from the yard signs 2 elections ago, was sitting on the porch. He saw Raymond's old sheriff's truck and turned the color of old dough. Raymond walked up the steps with the kind of unhurried authority that only comes from decades of doing exactly this. And within 4 minutes, my daughter was standing in the doorway. She was pale, and her hands were shaking slightly. But she was standing straight, and her eyes were clear. She took 2 steps off the porch and put her arms around me, and I held on and didn't say anything for a long time. When she pulled back, the first thing she said was, "Did you get my voicemail? I got it. I've been going through what I found. Dad, it's worse than I told you. So much worse." We spent that night at Raymond's house, all of us together, while Diane arrived 2 hours after we called her and spread documents across Raymond's dining room table until there was no more room, and she started stacking them on the kitchen counter. What she'd assembled over 6 years was methodical and damning. Financial records linking Cole's campaign funds to payments made to men who appeared in police reports around the same time families were having accidents. Emails written in careful corporate language that still left no doubt about what was being discussed. Signed agreements between Cole's development company and a private security firm that had no business being involved in residential property disputes. Most devastating of all were the photographs. Properties Cole had acquired at forced sale prices that were now part of a commercial development deal worth, by Diane's estimate, somewhere between $40 and $60 million. The Brennan land, the Whitmore farm, the Galloway property, parcels of bottomland and timber that families had worked for generations, transferred for fractions of their value to a man who had used his public office like a weapon. Raymond looked at it all with his jaw set and his eyes moving the way they used to when he was building a case. "This is enough," he said finally. "But we need it to mean something. We need it in the right hands. And we need Cole on record." I looked at my daughter. She was sitting at the table with her coffee, still pale, but thinking hard. The same expression she'd had at 9 years old, standing over that broken bicycle, calculating what she had and what she needed and what she was going to do with both. "He'll come to us," she said slowly. "If he thinks his documents are gone and he's exposed, he'll want to control the damage himself. He'll want to make a deal." She looked up at me. "Let him think he has the upper hand." My daughter had inherited her mother's precision. We used Raymond's old contact at the state attorney's office, and she connected us with a federal task force that, as it turned out, had already been looking at Cole from a distance for 2 years, without enough to move. Diane's records were exactly what they'd been missing. Within 48 hours of that conversation, we had agents, a plan, and a date. The hardest part was the waiting. I drove back to the farm and walked the fields the way I always did when I needed to think clearly. The corn was coming in well that year, despite a dry August. My father had always said this land knew how to endure, that you couldn't look at the soil here and not understand that it had been through hard seasons before and come back every time. I thought about Cole standing in front of his mirror every morning and looking at himself and seeing a man who deserved what other people had built. I thought about the Whitmore family signing papers from a hospital room. I thought about Eleanor's roses blooming along the fence without anyone helping them. I will admit that I came close to stepping back. Not from fear, but from a tiredness that went deeper than sleep could fix. I was 63 years old, and I had spent 11 years running a farm alone after losing my wife and trying to hold together the things she and I had built, while also watching my daughter grow into someone who didn't need me to carry her anymore. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from years of carrying things quietly, and it settled on me those 2 evenings in the field. I thought about what it would mean to simply sell, to take the money and let Cole have the land and walk away from all of it. Then I went back inside and looked at the kitchen table, at the window where Eleanor used to stand to watch the sunrise. at the chair where my daughter had done 12 years of homework. I called Raymond and told him I was ready. The meeting happened at the county agriculture office on a Thursday morning, a building Cole used for district meetings and one where he felt comfortable and in control. Diane had reached out to him through a back channel that suggested she had the documents and was prepared to negotiate, that the Hargrove family was frightened and willing to talk terms. Cole had taken the meeting. His arrogance was, in the end, his most reliable quality. He walked in looking exactly the way he always had. Good suit. Silver hair. The particular easy confidence of a man who had never once been made to answer for anything. He shook hands with people at every meeting as if he were the reason they'd been born. He sat down across from me with that handshake smile and said, "Thomas, I'm glad we could get here. I think we've let this go on too long. Don't you? Good neighbors can always find common ground." I looked at him and I thought about my daughter's voice on that voicemail. Steady and afraid and determined. I thought about the Whitmore boys' break line. I thought about Eleanor's roses. I said, "Tell me what you think our common ground is." Harrison. He was careful. He always was. He spoke in the language of opportunity and mutual benefit and moving forward. The smooth vocabulary of a man who had learned to say criminal things in ways that sounded like generosity. But Diane had worn a wire at Raymond's insistence, and the federal agents who had been building a case for 2 years were listening to every word through equipment that didn't miss a syllable. And as Cole grew more comfortable, as the meeting stretched and he became more certain he was in control, the language got less careful. He talked about my daughter and what she'd uncovered and how certain people in the county had ways of making documentation disappear. He talked about the Galloway situation and what had encouraged them to finally see reason. He talked about what he expected from me in exchange for what he called a return to normal. He was still talking when the door opened. The agent in charge was a woman about my daughter's age with a calm, the flat voice that cut through the room the way a straight edge cuts paper. Clean, and without hesitation. She said, "Major Cole, please don't move. I need you to listen carefully." She held up her credentials and let him look at them long enough to understand what they meant. Cole looked at her, then he looked at me, then he looked at Diane, who was standing near the window with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes carrying 6 years of patience and grief and relief all at once. "This is entrapment," he said. His voice had changed. The ease was gone, and what was underneath it was smaller and uglier than anything the suits had been hiding. "My attorneys will dismantle every piece of this. You have no idea who I have relationships with. The people who owe me in this county. In this state, Mr. Cole." The agent's voice was the same temperature as before. "You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." He didn't. For another 30 seconds. He said things that were frightened and ugly, and then his attorney, who had apparently been called the moment Diane reached out to him, put a hand on his arm, and he finally stopped talking. I watched them put the handcuffs on Harrison Cole in an agriculture office in Harlan County, and I felt something leave my body that had been sitting in my chest since 6 in the morning, on the day my daughter's car was found in a ditch with both doors open and the engine running. It wasn't satisfaction. Exactly. It was more like the feeling of setting down something very heavy that you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. My daughter was waiting in the parking lot. She had refused to sit in the building during the meeting because she said she didn't trust herself to stay quiet if she heard his voice. I walked out into the October sunlight, and she read my face before I said a word, and she breathed out in a way that I understood meant she'd been holding that breath since the night she'd disappeared. The months that followed moved faster than I expected, and also slower. The federal case against Cole was the kind that expands, the longer you look at it. And what prosecutors found when they began pulling the threads was a pattern of corruption going back not 9 years, but closer to 15. 7 families had been directly victimized in ways that ranged from financial coercion to the kind of thing that keeps investigators up at night. Cole's campaign manager, the man from the cabin porch, entered into a cooperation agreement early and provided testimony that locked everything in place. 2 of Cole's associates chose the same path. Diane testified in front of a grand jury for 3 days. She was composed and precise, and her documentation was treated by the prosecution as the backbone of the entire case. She had come to me the week after Cole's arrest and apologized. Quietly. For taking so long. I had told her she had nothing to apologize for. What she'd done had taken a courage. I had no interest in measuring against any kind of timeline. The sentencing happened on a cold February morning in a federal courtroom that was packed with people I hadn't expected to see. The Whitmore family, 3 generations of them, were in the 3rd row. The Galloways were behind them. The Brennan daughter, now in her 40s, sat near the aisle with her hands folded in her lap. I didn't speak to any of them that day. We didn't need to. We were all there for the same reason, and the room understood that without words, the judge sentenced Harrison Cole to 22 years in federal prison on charges of extortion, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and criminal enterprise. She read each charge clearly and looked at him directly while she did it. And he sat there in the suit that no longer fit the way it had and received every word. My daughter squeezed my arm when the gavel came down. Spring arrived the way it always does in Harlan County. Quietly, and all at once. The fields going green overnight, and Eleanor's roses coming in along the fence before anyone expected them. I was planting the east field on the first warm Saturday of April when my daughter came walking out from the house with 2 cups of coffee, and that particular expression she gets when she is working up to saying something she has been thinking about for a while. She handed me the coffee. We stood at the edge of the field and looked at the land the way I had looked at it since I was old enough to understand what I was seeing. Kevin asked me to marry him last night. She said. I looked at her. I said yes. Kevin was a good man, a soil scientist who had consulted for our county extension office for 2 years, and who had once spent an entire afternoon helping me diagnose a drainage problem in the south field without being asked and without expecting anything for it. He was the kind of person who showed up and did the work and never seemed to need anyone to notice. Eleanor would have loved him immediately. Your mother would be unbearable about this. I said. My daughter laughed. And for a moment, Eleanor was right there with us at the edge of the field, laughing at the same thing we were laughing at the way she always had. That whole and wholehearted laugh that made everything feel like it was going to be all right. We held the wedding on the farm in June, under the old white oak at the top of the east pasture that had been standing on this land longer than any of us could trace. Raymond walked her down the aisle they'd made between 2 rows of white chairs. Half of Harlan County came, it seemed, including families I'd known my whole life, and some I was only just meeting, families who had followed the Cole case and driven out to the farm to see the land that had been worth fighting for. Pastor Elkins from our church performed the ceremony, the same man who had presided at Eleanor's funeral 11 years ago, and who now stood under that oak and spoke about inheritance and legacy, not as things that are given, but as things that are chosen. Again and again, by people who decide that what came before them matters enough to protect. When my daughter and Kevin exchanged their vows, I thought about everything that had led to that afternoon. The phone call at 6 in the morning, the abandoned car on Route 9 with the engine running, the voicemail, Diane's 6 years of patient courage, Raymond's 45-minute drive that he made in 38, the way the land had looked the morning after Cole's arrest, the same as it had always looked, the same 212 acres. Still here, ordinary people, I have come to believe, are not a lesser category. They are simply people who have not yet been tested in the right way, given the right reason and the right moment. Ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. Diane Whitmore sat at a desk for 6 years and built a case out of stolen scraps and personal grief and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that the truth will come out eventually and that she will be the one to carry it. There. Raymond drove across 2 counties at 6 in the morning without asking a single question first. My daughter stood in front of a man who had made families disappear and refused to be one of them. Cole had thought he understood how the world worked. He had built a career on the belief that some people were permanently positioned above others, that money and office and the right connections made a man untouchable, that land and dignity were things that could simply be taken from people who didn't know how to fight back. He had been wrong about the land. He had been catastrophically wrong about the people at the reception. As the sun went down over the east field and the lights strung between the posts came on and someone's uncle started playing guitar near the barn, my daughter found me standing by Eleanor's rose fence. She leaned against the rail beside me. We stood there quietly for a while, the way we had learned to do in hard years, comfortable with the silence between us. She would have loved today, my daughter said. She would have taken about 400 photographs and cried through most of them, I said. And then she would have told everyone within earshot exactly what she thought of Kevin. In detail, in considerable detail. We laughed together. The roses were blooming, the same as every year, with no one to tend them and no particular reason to come back every summer except that they had decided to. I thought about my father and his father and Eleanor and the soil under our feet that had been through everything this county could send at it and was still here, still working, still giving back more than it received if you treated it right. That evening, after most of the guests had gone, I sat on the back porch where I had sat 10,000 evenings in my life, and I watched the stars come out over the Harlan County dark. The farm was quiet the way it gets after a good day. Settled and still. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like absence but like presence. I thought about what I wanted to pass on to whatever generation came next. Not the land itself, though the land mattered more than I could ever put into words. What I wanted to pass on was simpler and harder than that. The willingness to stay. The understanding that dignity is not something a powerful person can take from you permanently. The knowledge that ordinary people, when they stand together and refuse to be separated by fear, become something that no amount of money or office or connection can simply push aside. Harrison Cole had looked at 212 acres of bottomland and seen something he could take. He had been right about the value and completely wrong about the people attached to it. That miscalculation had cost him everything, and what it had cost him had returned to us, and to the Whitmores, and to the Galloways, and to the Brennan daughter, sitting in the third row of that federal courtroom with her hands folded in her lap. Justice does not always move fast, but in my experience it moves. When enough people are willing to carry it, I said a quiet prayer that night for Eleanor and for my father and for Diane Whitmore and her mother and for everyone who had sat in a hospital room or stood at a fence line and been told that what they'd built didn't belong to them anymore. And then I went inside and made myself a cup of coffee in Eleanor's kitchen, at Eleanor's table, in the house. That was still ours on the land, that was still ours. And I sat there in the good quiet of a farm at night, grateful, in a way I don't have adequate words for the simple and extraordinary fact that we had stayed. What about you? Have you ever had to stand your ground against someone who had more power than you and thought that made them untouchable? Leave a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I'd love to hear your stories. And if this one meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today.